All right, everybody, it's Friday Eve. Welcome back to the Horn Takes podcast. It's your very rough around the edges Texas sports talk destination. I'm your host, Sean Redfern. Today's our 100th episode, folks, and we're excited about that. I don't win a prize for having 100 episodes or anything crazy like that, but I just think it's kind of cool that I've managed to do something 100 times. We've been having a lot of fun with this. We started this podcast right after the Red River Shootout last season. That was the first time we did an episode. I had thought about doing a podcast for a while, and I had a TikTok channel. And my original idea for a podcast was kind of like a Big 12 podcast. You know, we would keep up with all the Big 12 goings on, all that kind of stuff. So I bought all this equipment, and I just never really got it off the ground, never really messed with it. And right when I was thinking about really putting some ideas together, I started having some, sort of brainstorming sessions with myself about this Big 12 podcast. And I'd even reached out to a couple people and got their thoughts. The announcement was made that Oklahoma and Texas were going to join the SEC. So I just never did anything with it. And then finally, after that Red River Shootout last season, I said, man, we're just going to go ahead and get it going, man. So we did. Here we are, 100 episodes later. The Big 12 Fuck You Tour resumes this Saturday. Been off for a few weeks from the Big 12 Fuck You Tour. We had a game against future SEC opponent Oklahoma, so we really can't count that as a Big 12 Fuck You Tour game. Then we had a bye week. Then we had games against new Big 12 members, Houston and BYU, so we really couldn't count those as Big 12 Fuck You Tour games. And now we're headed into the final stretch of the season, the final 4 regular season games. We've got K-State this Saturday, TCU, Iowa State, and then Texas Tech. And those will most definitely be Big 12 Fuck You Tour games. Hopefully Texas can take care of business in those 4 games. We'll head to the Big 12 championship game where we can have our final big fuck you to the Big 12. It's Deep Dive Thursday. We'll dive deep into the game this Saturday against the Kansas State Wildcats to see how we stack up statistically. We'll do Sean's 4 big questions of the game. Then we'll have some random sports thoughts. Check us out Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday around 12 noon. Sometimes we have to go 11:30. Sometimes we have to go 12. Tomorrow we may go at 11. You just never know. Depends on how my day looks. But we're always live on YouTube. We always post the podcast recording up on Buzzsprout, which always goes out to Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, all the various places where people cast pods. Check us out on Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube at Horn Takes, or that link to the podcast page is horntakespodcast.buzzsprout.com. Deep Dive Thursday, Kansas State Jayhawks. So every week we just start gathering some pretty major category type statistics for each teams. And then we gather the opponents that these teams have played and find their average rating, average yards. So for example, rushing yards, we would get the Kansas State rushing yards per game. We would get the Texas rushing yards per game. And then we'd find their opponents' rushing yards per game, average that out on defense. And then we compare the two, and that gives us a margin, offensive run margin in this case. So we go through that on running, passing, scoring, both offensively and defensively for both teams. We check out the strength of schedules, and we use Sagarin ratings. If there's better ratings out there, shoot me an email, let me know. Sagarin's been around for a really, really long time. Still in use as far as I know. Looking at these two teams, really close statistically. Texas rushes the ball 180 yards per game. Kansas State killing it on the ground, 226 yards per game. Texas's opponent's rushing D averages 156 yards given up on the ground per game. Kansas State at 150. So Texas has an offensive rushing margin of 24. Kansas State has an offensive rushing margin of 76, meaning Texas averages more yards on the ground, averages 24 more yards on the ground than their opponents give up on the ground on the season. Kansas State 76. That's pretty big. That's pretty huge. Matter of fact, it's almost 100 yards that they outrush their opponent's average for the season. Passing yards, Texas 274. Kansas State 238. Texas's opponent's average giving up 226 yards through the air per game. Kansas State's average giving up 222 yards per game through the air. So that's a 48 offensive pass margin for Texas, plus 48, plus 16 offensive pass margin for Kansas State. So rushing looks like Kansas State has the advantage in this game. Passing looks like Texas has the advantage in this game. Texas giving up 34 points a game, scoring 34 points a game. Kansas State scoring 37 points per game. Texas opponents on average giving up 25 points a game. Kansas State's opponents on average giving up 24 points a game. So again, small advantage to Kansas State on the offensive scoring margin. So 2 out of the 3 categories, Kansas State is actually better, not only just looking at the raw average, but also their margins against their opponents. Now we start getting into some of the more, I don't know, I wouldn't call them obscure, but just more like hidden statistical categories. Allowed sacks, Texas has given up 18 sacks this season. Kansas State giving up 11. Turnovers lost. Texas has lost 8 turnovers this season. Kansas State has lost 9. Tackles for loss allowed, Texas 45. That sounds like a lot. But then you think about it, and Texas's defense had 12 against BYU. So I think over 8 games, it's really not that bad. Still pretty high, though. It's like 5.5, 5 and a decimal per game that Texas has given up. Kansas State only given up 35 tackles for loss per game. Third down conversions, Texas is only converting at 40% on third downs. Kansas State, 55% on third down. So offensively, oddly enough, you got to give K-State a slight advantage. Then we look over at the defensive stats. Texas giving up 97 yards per game on the ground. Kansas State's giving up 109 yards per game on the ground. So both very good run defenses. Texas's opponents average 136 yards on the ground per game. Kansas State's average 170 yards per game on the ground. So the defensive run margins for this game are both positive for the teams, negative on our stat sheet, which is what they should be. Texas gives up 39 less yards per game on the ground than their opponent's average. K-State sitting at 61 less yards per game. Passing defense, Texas giving up 230 yards per game. Kansas State 234 yards per game. So very, again, across the board, you look at these stats, and it's very even across the board. Texas's opponents average 247 yards per game through the air. K-State's average 267 yards per game through the air. So the defensive pass margins minus 17 for Texas, minus 33 for K-State. So even the two categories where Texas, looking at the raw data, has an advantage, the margin is in favor of K-State. Scoring defense, Texas giving up 16 points per game, K-State giving up 15 points per game. And the reason they're giving up 15 points per game is they haven't given up a touchdown in 9 quarters. You got to go all the way back to the Texas Tech game. The third quarter of the Texas Tech game. Texas's opponents average 29 points per game on the season. Kansas State's opponents average 30 points per game on the season. So again, both teams negative on defensive scoring margin, which is a positive thing for those teams. Texas minus 13, Kansas State minus 15. So again, very close, just like offensively, very close in both the raw data and the margins. But I think defensively, just looking at that piece, you kind of have to go with K-State. Then we start looking at things like sacks. Texas has 19 sacks. Kansas State has 19 sacks on the season. Forced turnovers, Texas has 13 forced turnovers. K-State has 10. K-State's +1 on the season. Texas +5 on the season in turnover margin. Tackles for loss, these teams are almost identical. 55 for Texas, 53 for Kansas State. Third down conversion defense, these teams are almost identical. 27% third down percentage for Texas, 28% for K-State. So again, on paper, when you just look at raw data, you look at these margins, these two teams very, very similar. Looks like a type of game that could, come down to a single score late in the game. And it still could. But then you start looking at the strength of schedule. And I think this is where it starts to tilt a little. And this is probably why Texas is valued higher than Kansas State. It's probably why they're favored in this game. Texas's strength of schedule is 74.3. Again, these are Sagarin ratings. And the difference between just 1 point in Sagarin ratings could be a lot of spots, 1 through 130. 74.3 for Texas, 73.7 for K-State. Opponents' strength of schedule, 71.8 for Texas, 69.2 for K-State. That game against SEMO earlier this season really hurts their opponent's strength of schedule. So Texas's opponent's strength of schedule will be good enough for 46th in the country. K-State's good enough for 62nd in the country. So not only has Texas played a tougher schedule themselves, their opponents have played tougher schedules than Kansas State's opponents have played. Offensively, again, you got to give a slight edge to K-State, especially in the run game. I think that's where they really break away from Texas when you look at the offensive statistics. Texas's advantage in the passing game, which is only slight to begin with, I mean, it may not be that much of an advantage with Maalik Murphy. And we talked about Maalik Murphy having a pretty good game for a first start at the collegiate level. But I think Maalik Murphy's going to have to play a little bit better this week if Texas wants to come out on top against K-State. They say defense wins championships. And if that's the truth, both of these teams have a really good shot at being back in Arlington on December 2nd, playing for a championship and possibly winning a championship. Both these defenses are really good. K-State is one of those teams we talked about. There's 5 teams stuck at the top of the Big 12 at 4-1. You got K-State. You got Oklahoma. You got Texas. I think you got TCU. No, Iowa State. And then there's one more, Oklahoma State. all 4-1 in the Big 12. All those teams have to do is just keep winning. Every single one of them controls their own destiny. Texas plays 2 of them. Oklahoma State and Oklahoma play this Saturday. So again, the raw numbers for Texas's defense show Texas with a slight advantage, but the margins all favor K-State across the board. Texas has an advantage in all of those. Again, wouldn't call them obscure, but just not your major categories: sacks, tackles for loss, third down percentage, things like that. Texas has the advantage there. The thing with so we talk about strength of schedule, and we use strength of schedule in our score predictor. It's part of our formula. What's interesting though is how important, like the interesting question of strength of schedule is how important is it really? And I think when you look at all statistics, it's equally as important as anything else. Because we've talked about it before. All statistics will tell you and data analysis will tell you is what could happen based off of the past. It's never going to be able to tell you this is what will happen during this game. So all you can do is take both teams, all this data, crunch it all together, come out with some numbers, and say, based on what they've done this season, this is what should happen on Saturday for these two teams. Problem is, data analysis and those types of things can't factor in like human error, can't factor in weather. There's just a lot of variables that go into who wins a football game on any given Saturday between any two given teams than what they've done in the past. So right now we kind of put a little bit of importance on strength of schedule in our formulas. We think who you played and who you've built these statistics again matters almost as much as the statistics themselves. If I rush for 200 yards per game, but I do it against, I do it against 8 of the top 20 worst rushing offenses in the country, or rushing defenses in the country, then my 200 yards per game is probably not going to be 200 yards per game against somebody that's good stopping the run. Texas has a clear advantage in strength of schedule. So again, on paper, 2 evenly matched teams, it seems statistically. I got to give a slight edge to Texas just based off of strength of schedule. But I think you're looking at a game. I think you're looking at a game that could play out being a really, really close game with a lot of small moments throughout the game being sort of keys in the outcome of the game. Sean's 4 big questions of the game. How good is K-State really? So we just talked about the numbers. They look really good on paper. The problem is the only 2 quality teams they've played this season they lost to. They went on the road to Missouri, lost to number 12 Missouri, whose only loss was to LSU. Which, so for me, for K-State, that's, I guess you could call that a good loss. And then Oklahoma State, currently ranked 22nd. They lose that game. Oklahoma State has losses to South Alabama and Iowa State. And I know Iowa State's putting a nice little run together here in the Big 12 so far. But I don't think they're that good of a football team. And I know Oklahoma State has really come on late. Like really from that South Alabama loss on. They've played really well. But the problem is for K-State, those are the only 2 teams on your schedule so far that are quality, in my opinion. And the rest of them are just a bunch of bums at this point. So are they good losses? Maybe. But there's no good wins on this schedule to this point for Kansas State. They're 1-2 on the road. That's never good. Most of the time, you have to win road games. This game just happens to be on the road, so I think there's an advantage for Texas there. Obviously, their lone road win this year was against Texas Tech, and Texas Tech in that game started their second string quarterback and ended up having to play their third string quarterback for I think the entire second half. And that kid wrapped up the ball, put it under the Christmas tree, and woke Kansas State up early on Christmas morning. I think there was only 3 official interceptions in that game for this guy, but he threw the ball to Kansas State at least 5 times. And they were bad. I mean, they weren't like, we're not talking like tip balls at the line of scrimmage. We're not talking about wide receivers dropping the ball, deflecting it up. We're just talking about just completely terrible. A lot like Malik Murphy's last Sunday, or Saturday rather. Just threw it right to the wrong guy. Kansas State's sitting at the 25th toughest schedule in the country, which I'm kind of surprised by that. And again, their opponent's strength of schedule is only 62nd in the country, which, I mean, I guess that's top half. So I don't think we really know just how good Kansas State is. I think we're going to find out on Saturday for sure. This will certainly be a test. Question number 2, I think, is can the Texas offensive line answer the bell against a really tough K-State defensive front? We're going to see 3 down linemen, 4 linebackers, 2 cornerbacks, and 2 high safeties. The dreaded 3x8, as I like to call it, to make it simple. One of those linebackers is going to be a safety. Sometimes that linebacker / safety, he'll go deep, and there'll be 3 safeties across the top. So far under Steve Sarkisian, Texas has really, really, really struggled to do much offensively against that type of defense, and that's exactly what K-State's going to do. Not only that, they've always been real tough up front. I saw a graphic the other day. Like, if you look at Kansas State's average recruiting classes for the past 4 years, it's not good. It's like in the 50s, maybe, in the country. But those guys are always going to be tough, and they're always going to be disciplined. You got to think, I don't know what it is. I mean, K-State's never had really good recruits, but they always seem to have a pretty decent football team, and they got a team that can hurt you. Their defense is one of the best in the country at creating tackles for loss. I think you look at this Texas offensive line, they've struggled at times, really being physical at the point of attack. I worry about the interior especially. I think that was one of our concerns coming into the season, the interior offensive line for Texas. And I think at times this season, you've seen them sort of flash the potential. There's just no consistency. So they may block one run amazing, and then the very next one just gets stuffed. I think it's a big opportunity for Texas's O-line to put one together. We talked about it last week. Kind of take the game over. Take the load, the burden of your offense, and put it on our shoulders. Let's go just out physical this team, and let's go win a football game. That's the opportunity they have right out in front of them. But it's going to be tough. If it ain't tough, it ain't worth doing, though, right? Question number 3, who can win on first down, both offensively and defensively? Both of these defense are really, 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 really good on third down. They're at the top of the country. Offensively, the way you avoid third downs and the way you avoid third and longs is you got to win first down and you got to be disciplined, meaning you don't have penalties that set you back, put you behind the chains. Both of these teams are pretty good about being disciplined and not committing penalties. Kansas State only has 37 penalties on the season. Texas has 45 penalties on the season. 4 or 5 a game, roughly. K-State will spread you out offensively, but they don't really try to get the ball down the field. Most of those targets are right around the line of scrimmage. So I think if you're Texas, you got to look at this. How do we win defensively on first down? I think you got to gamble. I think you got to play tight to the line of scrimmage. You got to gamble that your back end can hold up in coverage or that your pass rush can get home. When you're talking about this winning first down business, I feel like both these defenses have an advantage over the offenses. I mean, this could potentially be one of those, really boring. People call it boring. I like to see scores too, but I can certainly appreciate a very good defensive effort. And this potentially is the type of matchup that could yield those results. Last but not least, on Sean's 4 big questions of the game, can the Texas offense find a way to score in the red zone? They're only 78% on the season inside the red zone. And that's field goals and touchdowns. So they only score 78% of the time. I think part of that, again, is just, we talked about this stubbornness Sark kind of has about, like, if he gets inside the 5, like, they're going for it 4 times, period. It's just what he's going to do. It is like a quest now. It's no longer, he's no longer thinking about it. It's like, we're going to ram this in. Most of the time, they don't ram it in. And then I think the other part of it is just poor execution. And the reason the reason it's not happening is probably mostly poor execution. But I think that percentage goes up if you just take some field goals every once in a while. I mean, sometimes it's just okay to kick a field goal. If they just would have kicked a field goal twice against BYU instead of getting turned away on 4th down and goal twice, that game would have been 41-6. And we talked about how 41-6 looks so much better for some reason than 35-6. But watching them get turned away on these 4th downs inside the 5 is just, it's like Groundhog Day moment, man. It's just like over and over again. You got this sense of impending doom anytime they cross the 5-yard line, which it shouldn't be this way, folks. We shouldn't have to say, oh shit, we got in the red zone. But that's what we have to say. You got to fix that. I think this would be a good week to fix it. I mean, I think points are going to be at a premium this weekend. And so any opportunity you get to take some points, I think you should. Obviously, situationally, there's different situations. I'm just saying, especially early in the game, take some points. Nothing wrong with taking some points. And I get that I get that he trusts the defense, and I think that's great. And the defense most of the time doesn't make him regret that choice because they get a stop. It's okay, man. You could get some points, kick the ball off, and then get a stop and get the ball back. K-State defense is holding its opponents to 80% inside the red zone. So not